Good afternoon. My name is Tony Solomon, and it's my great pleasure to welcome you to the first of our series of Inclusivity Works Lunch and Learn sessions. Now, today the spotlight is on mental health in the workplace. It's reckoned that at any one time, 1 in 6 of us are dealing with a mental health issue, and that stress, anxiety, and depression accounts for more than half of all sick days in the UK. It's a massive subject. Now, I work with the GEM Employability Project, GEM standing for Going the Extra Mile, and we provide one-to-one support for people in Gloucestershire that are facing barriers to getting into work or back into work, further education and training. We're funded by the European Social Fund and the National Lottery Community Fund. And over the last 5 years, we've supported around 2,000 people in Gloucestershire, many of whom I'm really pleased to say are in work and doing a great job, and others in training and further education. But one of the things that's come out of all the work we've been doing is a fresh initiative which we've called Inclusivity Works. It aims to raise awareness and support employers in recognising and realising the many business benefits of having diversity in your workforce and having an inclusive culture where people can bring their whole selves to work. Looking at the outcomes, and one of the outcomes, of course, of inclusivity and diversity is it's better for employees' mental health. Happier employees are healthier employees are more productive employees, more profitable. So it's a real win-win in every situation. Now, we're delighted to have with us this morning Chrissie Evans from Case UK. Hi, Chrissie. Case UK supports individuals who may be experiencing difficulties with their mental health in the workplace. Among many other things, they deliver the Able Futures programme, which is free, confidential, and provides support for up to 9 months. Now, Chrissie has been working in mental health for many years and is a qualified therapist with a wealth of experience in helping people through difficult situations. Before we start, just one thing on questions, because I'm sure you will have many. And this is a webinar, so there's quite a few of us on the call, probably about 60 of us on this call at the moment. So if you have questions, which we can ask at the end of Chris's presentation, could you just put them into the chat box or the Q&A box, please? And I'll make sure we get those picked up at the end. So without further ado, I'm going to hand over to Chrissie. And Chrissie, you're on mute.
Thank you. That's definitely the quote of the last 2 years, isn't it? You're on mute, I do feel. But thank you so much for the really kind introduction. And it is wonderful to be here with you all today. I really appreciate you taking the time out. Hopefully you've got a bit of lunch, you've got a cuppa, and we're going to talk about mental health, okay? So this is around raising some awareness around mental health. We're going to introduce the element of difficult conversations, because in relation to mental health, conversations can seem really hard to do, really difficult. I'm going to explore what mental health is, give you a bit of an overview, and then, as Tony said, any questions that you've got, pop them in the chat bar and we'll talk about them at the end. I can talk for hours and hours, and I'm not going to, I promise. I'm going to stick to my time, but I can talk for hours about mental health. And any questions, like I say, post them in the chat bar and we'll talk about them afterwards. So let's go. Where I got to, sorry, raising awareness of mental health, thinking about some specific difficulties, and we're going to look at some of the possible signs, which can be something that is very unique to every individual, which is why I think some people get really scared when it comes to talking about mental health. We're going to briefly explore how to support colleagues to manage their mental health in the workplace, things that we can look out for, signs to look out for. I want you to just be really wary of your own mental health as well, because in the nature of talking about mental health, sometimes it can cause some triggers. So I want you to think about when it comes to taking care of yourself, if there's something that comes up for you, please talk to somebody afterwards, okay? There are some sensitive topics in this webinar. So what is mental health? Mental health is something that, we hear a lot, and I think we've heard a lot about the term mental health during the last 2 years in particular. Some people call mental health emotional health. I always tend to talk about it as well-being. So it's just as important as good physical health. We all know how important it is to take care of our physical well-being, our physical health. We need to be equally as careful and take as much care when it comes to our mental well-being as well. So mental health is the way that we think, it's the way that we feel and the way that we act. It can affect our ability to cope with ups and downs. It can help us to determine how we handle stress, how we relate to others, and how we make choices. So sometimes our choices are very much influenced by how we experience struggle with mental health. So we might choose to avoid, or we might choose not to do things. We might get scared to do things. It can affect our capacity to learn, our capacity to communicate with others, to communicate with ourselves as well, and to cope with change. In the workplace in particular, when we're struggling with our mental health, we might find it really difficult to talk to our employees. If we, as managers, if as employers you struggle, then you might find it difficult to talk to other people about their mental health. Or you might think, I don't know how to start this conversation. I don't know how to approach it. So when it comes to mental health, there is a scale. And at what point does mental health become something that is problematic? And this here, and I always talk about mental well-being as a scale, because we can feel really well and we can go all the way to feeling very unwell. This in particular is about at what point we might feel that it's appropriate to tell somebody that they may need to access some help, or when we recognize it in ourselves. So when someone's healthy or normal functioning, or functioning normally, for want of a better word, there are normal mood fluctuations. So it's important for us to know that we all have mood fluctuation. Sometimes we're happy, sometimes we're sad, sometimes we're a little angry. It's perfectly normal to have fluctuation in mood. When we're feeling well, when we're healthy, we tend to take things in our stride. Our performance is consistent. So you'll notice in the workplace that people's performance is consistent. They don't seem tired. It might be that they have normal sleep pattern, and physically and socially a person is active. So usual self-confidence and comfortable with others, feeling comfortable within self. When we're reacting on this scale of mental health, there is a sense of common and reversible distress. So we might be a little bit irritable. We might be a little bit impatient. You might notice that you're a bit snappier than you normally would be, but nothing that is causing you any concern. There might be an increased sense of nervousness or sadness. So rather than the normal mood fluctuation, it's impacting a little bit more than it would. And your worrying might start to increase at this point. People might procrastinate, and obviously linked to the workplace, you might notice that people aren't completing tasks like they used to, or we might notice it in ourselves. We put things off, only just meeting deadlines, kind of giving ourselves a sense of, oh, I'll do that tomorrow. Oh, I'll push that into next week, and procrastinating, whether it's personally or professionally as well. We might become a bit more forgetful. We might have trouble sleeping, or more often find that we struggle to fall asleep, and then lowered energy or difficulty in relaxing. Some people have intrusive thoughts, so it can be like an internal dialogue that starts to become a little bit negative. We start telling ourselves that we're not very good at things. I'm not quite capable of doing the things that I need to do or that I want to do. I can't possibly go to that team meeting. It's all too much. And then decreased social activity. When it comes to healthy and reacting, we tend to find that self-care and social support is enough. So if you work with somebody and you can see that they're struggling, if you've kind of thought to yourself, I think that they're more so in the reacting stage, then you might tell somebody to access some other support, you might signpost, but self-care and social support should be enough at this point. When we go into the realms of what they class as injured, so significant functional impairment, this is where we're going into the realms of where people might class professional care as an intervention that's needed. I cannot stress enough that as individuals, though, every individual needs what they need, and that can be very different regardless of where on the spectrum a person is. But professional care or significant functional impairment is where anger is increased. So you're really noticing a difference. You might notice that people are snappy, or people aren't acting in a way that is usual to their behavior that you know them to behave like. There might be anxiety or a lingering sadness. So we've gone from a normal mood fluctuation to feeling a bit sad to having quite a lingering sadness, feeling very tearful, hopeless and worthless. There's a preoccupation with thinking about situations, scenarios, what ifs. Performance at work decreases. There are significant changes in a sleep pattern and avoidance of social situations or withdrawing from situations. And then when a person is ill, so we're talking here clinical disorder, severe and persistent functional impairment. This is where significant difficulty with emotion can be experienced. So we're talking about high levels of anxiety, panic attacks quite frequently. The mood is extremely low. Some people experience depression, feeling overwhelmed or constantly fatigued. The sleep pattern is all over the place. There's a disturbed contact with reality. Some people, when they get into this, they don't feel connected to self. They feel as though they're kind of watching themselves go through the motions of life. So at this stage, there could be the potential for suicidal thoughts, suicidal ideation, or intent or behaviours. So there is a whole spectrum, and sometimes we don't just fit into one box, because very rarely do we fit into one particular thing that is expected. So we can go between the two. We can go from being healthy to feeling very ill, and we can go up and down this spectrum depending on things that we're experiencing. So with that in mind, because again, like I said, as employers, it's good to have an idea of what mental health is and how it can deteriorate, because knowing these things can help us to recognise them in others. So mental health difficulties in the UK, and I know 1 in 4 people, the reality of how many people actually experience a mental health difficulty each year is probably closer to 1 in 2, so 50%, which is not statistically the information that's out there, but how many people in this space here have gone out and said that they are struggling with mental health? Because quite often people don't talk about it, and that can be for varying reasons. It can be because of stigma. It can be because they think, oh, I best not tell anyone that I'm struggling. And we might be able to see that a person is struggling. It can be quite difficult for some people, though, to talk about their mental health. Some of the types of mental health difficulty, it can be anxiety, depression. Some people experience psychosis, bipolar, PTSD, suicidal behaviours. There are many different ways that a person might struggle with their mental health. So common mental health difficulties in the workplace, number one thing that we see as the difficulty that people experience in the workplace is anxiety and depression. Stress being the overarching what is causing people to feel this way. So stress in the workplace is the number one mental health difficulty that we work with. It's really high up. It's much further up than any other mental health condition that we see. So some of the general signs of deterioration at work. So some of the things that we would look for in other people is the importance to notice changes to someone's usual behaviour. So if you know somebody well, then you're going to notice if there's changes, whether that is in the, if you're with somebody in the physical environment or virtually, you will notice changes to somebody's usual behaviour. Maybe you notice that someone is more tired than usual. If you're having a one-to-one conversation, encourage somebody to have their camera on. You cannot see somebody if their camera is off, and I appreciate that it can be really difficult for some people because they don't like to have that sort of presence in meetings, which is fine. But if you're having a one-to-one, a conversation, encourage it, because you will start to see the things that you would in the physical world. Maybe you notice that someone isn't looking after themselves like they normally would, or they're making uncharacteristic mistakes in their work. They might be lacking in motivation. Maybe somebody's constantly saying how I can't be bothered, I don't want to do this, or not getting involved like they used to, not seeming as enthusiastic, or their mood has completely changed. It could be a sense of poor concentration. You notice that somebody's concentration has gone, or their timekeeping has changed. Their timekeeping is completely off to what you know their timekeeping to be like. Maybe you notice tempers are becoming flared. In meetings, there's more conflict, there's more arguments. Maybe somebody is more argumentative with you. You notice that their temper has become very short, and they argue back with things that you don't really understand why they're doing that. Or a person has become avoidant. Maybe they're avoiding meetings, maybe they're avoiding conversations, maybe they're avoiding one-to-ones. Or you notice that somebody is unable to cope with the work demands. Having poor mental health in the workplace has its implications. As we know, there are higher rates of absenteeism, so we know that people take more time off. There are also higher rates of presenteeism, where people feel that they cannot take time off. So they turn up to every meeting. They are there saying yes to everything. They are present constantly, to the detriment of their own well-being. There are increased accidents. When we're stressed and overwhelmed, we tend to try and rush things. We tend to try and do too many things all at once. And so accidents happen. The staff turnover can be increased because the more stressed people feel, the more people say, oh, it must be work. Oh, I must leave. I can't do that. And then conflicts can happen as well, as we said earlier. So it can be really difficult to pinpoint direct causes of mental health issues. And as employers, you're not going to come away from this webinar being experts in mental health, but what I hope you do come away with is an idea of what you're looking out for, a bit of food for thought about how you can help other people. I've worked in mental health for years, for many years. I don't have magic words. I sit and I listen to people, and that is one of the key points. So when it comes to thinking about direct causes, we're not going to go away and actively try and pick through all of the history of somebody that is an employee, but we're going to be mindful. If we know of one of these situations, then we can identify that as a potential trigger. But ultimately, you have a conversation, and that's where it begins. But the triggers that can possibly lead to mental health problems, here are just a few. Abuse or neglect. Social isolation has been such a big topic over the past 2 years, and we recognise just how important connection is. And we also have recognised how important it is not to make assumptions, because somebody can be alone but not feel lonely. Somebody can be in a room full of people and feel completely lonely. It's an individual thing. But bereavement, stress, housing situation, social disadvantage, physical health conditions, all of these things can have an impact and become a trigger to mental health struggles. Okay. So the stress vulnerability model, we can all have our limits when it comes to stress, how we feel about it. So stressful events and vulnerability, the more stressful events we experience, if we're not doing things to look after our well-being, if we're not encouraging others to look after their well-being or having conversations in the workplace, if we put a lot of work on somebody and then don't encourage them to look after their well-being, then we find that stress threshold will reduce and it will become a lot easier to push somebody over that stress threshold where they feel unwell. So if we had 5 stressful events and our vulnerability was low, if we're feeling resilient, then we deal with it well. And then those same 5 events, the more we don't look after ourselves, the more just one of those 5 things would push us over that stress threshold into feeling unwell and feeling incapable and unable to cope. And it becomes a vicious circle, because the more a person tells themselves that they cannot cope, the more it impacts on their stress, and then they start to tell themselves that they can't cope with anything at all in the worst case scenarios. We all have an internal thermometer. The internal thermometer will rise and fall depending on our triggers. What we don't want is to reach boiling point where survival mode kicks in, because when survival mode kicks in, our body gets us to a place where we prepare to fight or to run away. When we get into that space when we're not able to fight and we're not able to run away, we can end up having some of the things that we've talked about when it comes to feeling unwell. We can be in a headspace where we start to become forgetful, we start to become overwhelmed. Fight or flight is preparing the body to do something very physical, and then we can end up feeling unwell and awful. And again, it feeds into that lack of awareness, thinking that we're not capable and therefore knocking our confidence. Okay, so people wait before telling a friend or family member about a mental health difficulty, and how long that is, over a year. Generally, statistics show that people will wait for at least a year. This is something that can be a lot longer for some. Some people say they wait years and years before telling anyone that they've struggled with their mental health. Okay, so mental health, there are myths, there are facts. Some of the myths that we always hear, people with mental health problems are always dangerous. And the facts speak for themselves, because the majority of violent crime is committed by individuals without a mental health problem. Individuals with mental health problems are more likely to be attacked than attack. 45% of those have been victims of crime in the last year. And then also the other thing, mental health is a sign of weakness and failure. Well, mental health is common, or mental ill health is common and can affect anyone. Anxiety, stress can affect any one of us. It isn't a sign of weakness or failure. It's a sign of needing to do something to look after ourselves. I also hear quite often, oh, it's not possible to treat. Well, there are many, many different ways to treat the ways that we struggle with mental health. It's important to know that. So it's important, again, with supporting mental health and having those difficult conversations, think about how well you know your team. Could you do more to support each person? Could you do more to support them as a team or to support them individually? Would you know where to go to get support for yourself as employers, as managers? Would you know what to do? Could you spot the signs of changing behaviour, and how would you approach the subject? So think about it. Think about what you would do to be able to talk to people and listen to your team, listen to yourself as well. Once stress gets a grip, it tends to keep a grip. So self-confidence drops. Stress really impacts our sense of self-worth, because we tell ourselves that we're not coping. You feel threat from all sides and you doubt your ability to cope. You can't stop your mind from racing. So if you've got employees that are really struggling with stress, you're going to see that there's many of these things that they might be experiencing. The body can react very easily. So you might notice somebody sweating more, or they're shaking, or they're nervous. You might feel that stress brings out the worst in you. Stress tends to bring out the worst in us, tends to make us a bit angry and a bit snappy, and you feel you can't control your life. So you may feel that your back is against the wall. With depression then, so depression can be a sense of feeling tired, low mood, feeling sad, loss of interest, or devoid of emotion. And that can be the scariest thing for some people. They don't feel anything at all. They feel completely disconnected. And then a difficult topic, I fully appreciate that, talking about suicide, but suicide is the leading cause of death for adults under 50 in the UK. It's important for us to open up these conversations. Around 3 times as many men die as a result of suicide compared to women. And female UK suicide rates are at their highest in a decade. In 2018, the suicide rate in Wales was 12.8 deaths per 100,000, so 349 deaths. And so far, the statistics, I know people ask about during lockdown, but the statistics haven't caused that to increase. But it's a lot, isn't it? Some of the warning signs that we might notice in others is that sense of feeling worthless or hopelessness or no hope. You might notice that somebody's isolating themselves, or it's the wording that they use. You don't need to be physically in the same room as somebody to hear the words that they're saying. You might notice that somebody is aggressive or irritable, or they might tell you that they suddenly are possessing the lethal means to be able to take their own life. They might talk about how they're a burden, or their mood changes, or they're giving things away and you think, gosh, why are you giving away all your worldly goods? Or they're getting their affairs in order. Okay, so some of these things can be signs that someone is struggling. So approaching someone that is struggling, ask a person if they're okay. That's where it begins, having that conversation, feeling comfortable and saying that it's okay to ask that question. Be open and listen without judgment, and don't deflect what's being said. If somebody tells you that they're struggling, don't go, oh, don't worry, talk to someone else. Just be there and go, okay, talk to me. What's going on? Consider emotional triggers. Be supportive, but be clear. You have your own boundaries as well. Highlight strengths to somebody when it's appropriate. And ensure that if you have supervision or if you have performance reviews, then it's regular, and that well-being is always a topic of conversation, and it needs to be one of the first topics of conversation, because quite frequently in one-to-one reviews or supervision, whatever wording you tend to use, when you're having that one-to-one conversation with somebody, well-being tends to go at the end, and then you might run out of time. It's important to make it a priority. When you're having conversations, think about providing space to listen and hear. Think about how you're coming across. When you're talking in a virtual world, you can still maintain eye contact. If I'm looking away from the screen, and I appreciate you can't see me at the moment, but if I'm looking everywhere but the screen, it's obvious. You can see that. Try and avoid distractions, and don't interrupt or cut a person off. Allow them space to be able to say what they need to. Think about your own boundaries. You have them, and it's okay to have boundaries. We need to have boundaries when it comes to the work that we do. So ensure that you're providing support. Know when you need to seek further help. Know when you need to signpost somebody. Have a list of numbers available that you can provide. Be clear of expectations. Never tell somebody that, call me anytime, because that's never realistic. So it's always important to make sure that somebody has the opportunity and the resource to call someone else, such as a helpline, or they have their options available to them, and understand what is reasonably expected of you. So have a think of your own workplace. So what do you already do to support good mental health? If you've got lots of things in place, brilliant. Where can you improve? What else might you need to introduce based on some of the ideas that I've just brought to the table? Look after everyone's well-being, including your own. That's one of the key messages. You need to make sure that you look after people, but you need to look after yourself as well, because quite often when you're supporting employees, it can be easy to forget that you have your own well-being to consider as well. And then think about 5 ways to well-being. It can be about connecting, being active, taking notice, keeping learning, giving and volunteering. We can go into more depth about that afterwards if we need to. And then take our message, become a role model. promote and maintain good mental health for yourself. It will encourage other people to do the same. Talk more and be open about mental health and challenge the stigma. Be the change that you want to see in relation to mental health. And then get involved in raising awareness to become a champion. Get involved in Mental Health Week. Thursday is actually the Time to Talk Day this week. So get involved in Time to Talk Day. And then there's suicide prevention. There's lots of different events throughout the year. And then there's just a bit of information about what I work with. So Able Futures. We provide support for people in work that are struggling with mental health. It's free and it's confidential. Provide support for an individual for up to 9 months with a dedicated support team. So an individual support worker and then a support team in the final 3 months. And there's some information on how to refer yourself. And that brings me to the end of this webinar. So we can move on to some questions. And I apologize again for the tech issues at the beginning. I really don't know what happened. We were fine up until that moment, weren't we?
We were, Chrissie. Thank you so much. Put your video back on if you would, and we'll get rid of the slides and we'll just have your face on. That should be absolutely fine. Thank you so much. That was crammed full of such useful information. And we have some questions which we'll get straight into if we may. I've got one here. How do we approach a colleague who has disclosed they have a mental health issue and are actively taking medication several months after they've actually started in the job? What would you advise there?
Okay, so if somebody has disclosed that they've got struggles with their mental health and they're taking medication, for me, I would ask what it is that they're hoping for. So do they want some additional support? Do they need some additional support from you as their employer? What can you help to signpost them to if needed? Are they just looking for that conversation with you? Are they just looking to tell you that actually I have mental health needs? Or is there something else that they're looking for? Because quite often when people come to you asking you or telling you about their mental health, it's usually because they feel comfortable in that moment to disclose. There might be something additional that they want as a result of having that conversation. It's about finding out what that is and having a bit of a further exploration of what those needs are. Because when someone tells you they're on medication, I think sometimes we get a bit worried, don't we? And we think, oh gosh, medication, right, what do I do here? But actually they're on the medication. Hopefully it's helping them. If it's not, that's, we're not GPs. And medication isn't something that we're going to be able to change. But if someone tells you that they're taking medication and they feel unwell, refer them back to the GP.
Thank you. Got a really topical question here, is how can we spot the signs and support people who are working from home or hybrid working?
Oh, absolutely. And I think over the past couple of years, hybrid working from home has become the norm. And I don't think we'll move fully back to being ever in office environments, will we? And it's quite a strange place to be. But one of the things that's really important for spotting the signs is to allow yourself to know that you're still looking for the similar signs. There are some things that we cannot see when we're not in the physical world with somebody, but when we're spotting signs, we might notice that somebody has their camera off and they never have their camera off before, or that somebody, you can see their appearance if you're doing a one-to-one. You can hear in their voice, you can tell by the words that they use if they're struggling, and that tends to be what we need to look for more. We need to make more use of hearing what somebody's saying rather than thinking about being in that physical space with them. And I think one of the things that holds us back is that we worry that we're not going to be doing as much or enough because we don't have as much visual then on people. And I know that that is a concern for many, many people. But another important thing for us to do is ensure that we allow ourselves or that we make sure that we're checking in You know, if you work with 5 members of your team, then at some point each week, always have a touch point, always have a point of contact where you're checking in. Some people have introduced having virtual coffee meets. So they're replicating some of what they would do in the office, where you might stop and have a cuppa and a chat, and they've replicated doing things like that. Some people have got meets where they talk about things like Netflix. You know, it's a short burst in the day, but it's trying to replicate some of the things that people feel as though they've lost, which impact on their well-being.
Excellent. And as you say, a massive new issue, and it's requiring new management skills to really tackle and grapple with that.
It is.
Right. Got interesting things here, actually, from Juliet. She's put something in the chat. You can also use a RAP or a WAP tool, Wellness Recovery Action Plan, where people fill in a tool to let you know what support they'd like. Any thoughts or comments on that?
I think that there are a wealth of different resources that can be used, some wonderful ones. Mind have got an excellent tool as well with a wellness action plan, where it's you literally write down what you need from employers. So as an employee, you can write down what you need from your employer, and then when you're struggling, there's an action plan to refer to. There are some wonderful resources. So thank you for sharing as well, because it's great to be able to share ideas, isn't it?
Yeah.
About what works.
Yeah. Mind.org.uk is obviously a good resource. This is an interesting one. If a colleague has a low mood and low performance in their role, how do we talk to them to understand what is going on? They might tell us they're fine, because that's a bit of a default, isn't it? I'm fine. But the signs are that they're not fine.
And yeah, it is a default, isn't it? If I had £1 for every time somebody said, or I've heard someone say, "Are you okay?" "Yep, fine, thanks." It's a bit of an ongoing thing, isn't it? And I've heard many dialogues about the "I'm fine, I'm okay," because we tend to, it's like an automatic response these days, isn't it? What is really key is letting somebody know that you're genuinely there to listen. So if you say, "Are you okay?" "Yeah, fine, thanks." Go, are you honestly okay?" It's double asking, which sounds a bit of a bizarre tool to use, but when you double ask, you ask someone if they're okay, they get their automatic response out of the way, and when you ask again, "Are you okay?" Then if they still go, "Yeah, don't worry about me, I'm fine," ask more questions. Don't ever be afraid to ask questions and say, "Look, I've noticed you're not yourself at the moment. Would you like to have a conversation? I'm here for you if you need to talk about something." You don't have to go, "Look, your performance is rubbish." You don't have to approach it in that way. You can approach it from, like I said, telling somebody that, "Oh, I've just noticed you don't seem okay. You don't seem happy. You don't seem yourself." It's okay to ask questions. It's also okay if you notice that somebody's mood is incredibly low and you are worried about suicidal ideation. It's okay to say, I've noticed you're very low. Have you had thoughts about taking your own life?" It's okay to ask questions. And I think we get very scared, don't we, about asking these questions, because we think we're going to make it more likely. And that's not the case. We don't make it more likely. We might open up the conversation that somebody needs, and then, it's a scary space to be in, isn't it? But it's important.
It is important. And I think your top tip there is the double ask. How are you? "I'm fine." "No, how are you?"
Yeah.
And that draws out so much more potential information. Another one here. A gentleman's asked, how would I approach, as an employee, working under managers who aren't being or working in a mental health aware way? So just good old fashioned managers, business, profit, not into all this mental health stress stuff. How would I approach that as an employee who may be having mental health problems?
That's a very interesting question, isn't it? And it's something, again, I've spoken to a few people, and more so on a one-to-one basis when it comes to this in particular. I think if you've got somebody that is not addressing mental health, that is not being very fair, think about your options. Think about what you're able to do as an individual, because if you're not able to go to that manager and say, "Look, I need to talk about my mental well-being," or "We need to be more mental health aware," then what are the options? So is it talking to somebody like the Able Futures programme? Because that is one of the reasons that we're there. So people, when they don't feel like they've got anyone to go to, they can come to us for support. It doesn't address the managers that aren't being very supportive, but it can help to have the opportunity to really talk about what the needs for that individual, for you as an employee is, and what you feel comfortable doing. Because not everyone feels comfortable challenging a manager if they're not being very mental health aware.
Absolutely.
And sometimes there are other ways to approach it, such as, you know, recommending that somebody approach an organisation and offer some support. And it doesn't have to be from that, well, you're working, you know, your employee has asked me to do this. There can be ways of working around it, but finding other solutions, because like I say, it's not always an easy thing to tell somebody that they're not being that helpful.
Okay. Now I'm going to draw us to a close there, because I'm very, very conscious of time. We've answered the questions that have been asked, and thank you again, Chrissie, and thank you all very much for joining us today for what I hope you found to be a very interesting, informative and useful session. And Case UK, it's well worth visiting the website and looking at the resources that Chrissie and her team are able to offer. Now, next Tuesday lunchtime, our focus is on employing ex-offenders. Our speaker is a gentleman called Peter Atherton, who spent most of his life in care and within the prison system before creating an organisation that mentors and supports ex-offenders, helping them to bring their lives back on track. Now, Pete brings with him a wealth of experience in rehabilitation and working alongside employers. We do hope that you'll be able to join us same time next Tuesday, 12 o'clock, and that you'll share this with your colleagues who may be interested.